Hey, what is going on everybody, and welcome to Fantasia. For today, we're going to be jumping into another session of Epic 7. Now, today, got a tier list for you guys. This time around, we're going to be doing the 5th anniversary 5-star artifact selector tier list. I know that's quite a title, but I'm doing this one first because for most of you guys, in about a day or two, you'll be able to select your 5-star artifacts. Meanwhile, the 5-star RGB unit selector is going to be coming in another week or so. So that's the second week of logins. So I decided to go ahead and put this together for you guys first, and then we'll talk about the other one. The other video will be uploaded in the next few days. If you guys want to have access to this tier list maker, though, go ahead and check out the description below. I will have a link to it so you can make your own if you want to share your opinions. But yeah, these are all just my thoughts and opinions on these artifacts. So if you have something that's different about them, that's perfectly fine. It's your selector, you get to choose your artifact. But this is just my advice for players who are kind of unsure of what to pick. And yeah, let's just go ahead and jump into it. First things first, on the left side, we have all the tiers that I've made. The first category is the must-own category. In my opinion, these are the ones that are so widely used among all the units in the game, especially for their classes, because a lot of artifacts are class-locked. Like, you just can't pass them up, right? You can't, for some units, you can't even play the game without these artifacts. It is game-changing. Next up, we got the very strong tier. So the very strong tier are very impactful artifacts. I would say that they're just overall best in their class, and you'll see when we talk about some of them how strong they are. The next one, we have just the strong. So these are just pretty decent, versatile, good on, if you're unsure of what to put on a unit, this is probably gonna do, right? Is those types of artifacts in here. Pretty generic use. Then we have some niche artifacts. So the niche category is all stuff that maybe 1 or 2, possibly 3 units in the game can utilize these. And most of these artifacts here, I'm ranking them based on a PvP and PvP PvP and PvE perspective. Although it's a bit more emphasis on PvP, because for PvE you have really generic things like Daydream Joker and stuff that you're probably going to be using to deal damage with. Alright, and then next up we have the Just Don't category. These are not necessarily like terrible artifacts. For example, you see Durandal over here, which I do use on some units, but they're just not worth you using your 5-star artifact selector on, so I put them in here. And then last but not least, we have the unavailable. So these are the artifacts that are not available for selection because they're either guild artifacts, for example, like Bastion of Hope or Symbol of Unity, or they are limited artifacts, so associated with limited banners like Benimaru's Tachi or Champion's Trophy. Right, so let's go ahead and jump into the actual tier list now, starting off with the must-own. So in here we have, first of all, Elbrus Ritual Sword. That's right, this is not here just because MO Landy exists and everyone wants an Elbrus Ritual Sword for MO Landy. Elbrus, well, by the way, if you have MO Landy, you don't have Elbrus, grab an Elbrus. It is her best in slot artifact, and it will make your life a lot easier with MO Landy. That being said, Elbrus Ritual Sword is fantastic on pretty much every knight that is not a pure support or tank knight. So if you have something that's not LRK or ROL, if you have a damage dealer like Ilanov, the Great Mortelix, Charles back in the day was infamous for using Elbrus Ritual Sword. Yeah, it is a fantastic artifact. Even niche units like Armin, Green Armin, utilize this as an anti-cleave measure. Right, so fantastic artifact. Definitely, you pretty much need to have at least a copy on your account for that knight that really needs it on your team. Next up, we got Sigurd's Scythe. So in the same realm as Elbrus Ritual Sword, Sigurd's Scythe is pretty much used universally on like a ton of warriors. For me personally, I have it on things like Edward Elric. You can put it on things like Emma Bologna. I've seen people use it on things like Fire Ravi, right? I use it on Benimaru, for example. Most bruisers are going to want Sigurd's Scythe or Golden Rose. Now, that's probably the other thing that I need to discuss here, is Golden Rose, which I put down here in unavailable because I'm pretty sure it's not available in the selector. Correct me if I'm wrong. If I am wrong, just move the Golden Rose up here in like the first slot, because it is like hands down one of the best artifacts in the entire game, with both lifesteal and damage built into it for HP scaling bruisers. Essentially, it just ups your damage flat, right? Flat just damage increase, as opposed to Sigurd's Scythe, which is attack increase. So a lot of HP scaling or defense scaling units don't necessarily benefit as much from it. Alright, that's it for the must-own category. Next up, we got the very strong category. So these are the very impactful artifacts, starting off with Abyssal Crown. That's right. This artifact is absolutely disgusting, and it's used on units like Politis, degen Politis a lot in the meta. You will see sometimes when Politis does an S2 or something, you see a unit or two stunned. It's because the player is running Abyssal Crown. Really good control artifact, used on quite a few degen annoying units throughout the years, right? Back then, people ran Abyssal Crown Dizzies, for example. It was absolutely disgusting. Okay, next up we got RNL. I don't think I need to explain this. Everyone, I think, has the trauma of fighting Rons in in Guild War, and then they proc RNL, and then you're just dead. So yeah, RNL is a artifact that has actually a pretty high % chance to proc, especially for units that can already take extra turns like Ron or Peyra, and they help you generate souls, take additional turns, get additional benefits from those units. So Ron, for example, can just output a bunch of damage for free. Peyra, for example, if she takes another turn, you can stun a unit with her S1. So very versatile artifact, and can actually be used on some damage dealers as well. People use it on damage dealers to cheese wins, take an extra turn and just, you know, for example, if you have like an Arbiter Vildred, back in the day, some people used RNL on Arbiter Vildred, so you can just S3, kill some stuff, take an extra turn, uh-oh, we got an S3 again, and just kill some more stuff. It's really gimmicky, but the % chance is pretty high, so pretty useful. Next up, we got Shepherd of the Hollow. This is really, really strong for a lot of evasion units, BBK, K-Ron, usually used on Remnant Violet, though. Fantastic artifact for just increasing damage output while increasing evasion, and your damage output increases as your HP decreases, so it's pretty good for self-sustaining units like Violet to have. Next up, we got Song of the Stars. This artifact is kind of insane in both PvE and PvP. It's one of the few kind of PvE artifacts in here, actually. Song of the Stars is kind of seen a resurgence with Lua against the Lilius. Fire Lilius counterpick. So if your Lua has Song of the Stars, you can sleep the Fire Lilius, and she won't be able to cleanse the sleep because she'll cleanse the target debuff from Song of the Stars instead, which makes Lilius, which essentially makes Lilius useless as a counter into Lua, right? Especially if you're running Ancient Dragon's Legacy on her, she won't be able to proc her S2. So Song of the Stars, though, is also really strong in PvE. You use it mainly to just put target debuff on something, on a unit, with a unit that has a defense break in their kit. So for example, Iceria is a very common unit that's used with Song of the Stars. You could also use this on, for example, like Leo, if you're doing like a Banshee one-shot. And it just lowers the gear requirements that you need, because the extra 15% damage from a target debuff is actually pretty big. Alright, and next up we got Wind Rider. So I slapped Wind Rider in here because this thing is absolutely nutty for any thief that can actually use this. Most damage dealing thieves would love this. Not only does it grant you stealth, but it gives you an absurd amount of attack, and even more attack after you kill somebody. So you get to stealth, you basically get to stay safe until your next turn, and then you nuke something again, right? And then hopefully, ideally, you get to replenish your stealth every turn until you win. So units that I have that utilize this, for example, are like Kisei. Kisei is fantastic with this. Not only can she self-stealth, but you know, you can maintain that stealth throughout the entire fight if you play correctly, right? So really, really strong and impactful artifact. Next up in the strong category, a lot of these things here are pretty generic, so you can use them on a lot of units. If you're like, I don't know what to put on my ranger that deals damage, well, Air to Surface Missile Misha is fantastic because not only does it grant extra crit damage, but you also get extra hit chance to help against those evasion units. We got Merciless Glutton here. Not only does it help with your damage output, but it also gives you combat readiness. So Merciless Glutton is actually used quite a bit in cleave teams and cleave units because combat readiness keeps up the tempo of your team, and it actually helps you bridge What I mean by bridging is that if you have a unit that goes first, you have a unit that typically follows up afterwards that bridges to cut in front of your opponent's units. So let's say you open up with a Ron and you have a follow-up unit like Jacko. So Jacko gets pushed up because Ron debuffs somebody, and then Jacko gets to go kill someone. Jacko usually is carrying something like Merciless Glutton. So Jacko gets to kill somebody, and then because of the kill, Merciless Glutton procs, pushes up the entire team, so you have more DPS units that follow up right after, and you can keep up the pace and cleave. Used in a lot of aggro teams as well. You usually see this with something like Zeo and Euphine. Euphine will be on Merciless Glutton, and you can abuse it that way as well. Next up, we got Alexa's Basket. This is usually used on things like Arbiter Vildred or Tempest Surin, usually units that have a lot of burst damage that you really want to kill somebody with. So greater attack buff is nothing to laugh at, even in this day and age. 2023, right? Arbiter Vildred coming back in the meta. But yeah, you can use this on things, even things like Kisei or stuff that are built really fast. You just want to take that first turn, pray that you get a greater attack buff, and then nuke somebody and send them to the Shadow Realm. Next up, we got a couple of Soulweaver artifacts. So Rod of Amaryllis, Celestine, and Doctor's Bag. All of these have kind of different proc conditions. Rod of Amaryllis and Doctor's Bag are non-attack skills. Doctor's Bag can activate once every 3 non-attack skills, I believe. And then Celestine procs off of S1s. All of these are really good for Soulweavers. I've been finding myself wanting more and more Celestines nowadays. And Rod of Amaryllis 1 is usually enough, but Celestine, I'm finding so many units that want it. Sharoon, DDR, alright, any counter Soulweaver that uses it. Shuna as well benefits a lot from Celestine, just healing up the entire team. Yeah, overall pretty good artifacts over here for Soulweavers. Doctor's Bag is pretty decent as well. You can also use it in Ancient Inheritance, which is pretty good for things like green lots, right? In Ancient Inheritance is also a really good artifact. Speaking of a little bit of PvE, we got Bloodstone over here. Bloodstone's really good for certain hunts. Azimanic, if you're not doing one-shots, right, that is. Azimanic, for example, it's really good in. It's also good in the Earth Expedition. If you have a full fire team and you have Kana holding a Bloodstone, she usually does enough damage and healing for the entire team to keep everybody alive, so you don't need to bring a healer. Bloodstone's also just really good for certain builds on units, like, for example, Counter Landy with Bloodstone. It's going to be pretty decent. And yeah, next up, Double-Edged Decrescent. You guys probably have seen a lot of Rylets running this, and they Luxac. So basically, if your unit gets to evade successfully, they have a % chance to counterattack, with Rylet having a pretty decent chance to evade. If it's on the right side of the screen, it'll probably proc Double-Edged Decrescent, and then you're going to get Luxacked. But yeah, overall, pretty solid artifact. There's nothing really wrong with it. The reason I have it down here, and Shepherd of the Hollow up here, is because Shepherd of the Hollow is more consistent with its damage output, and Double-Edged Decrescent, you don't get any damage increases, you just get a chance to do an extra S1, right, on a counterattack, which can actually be pretty impactful, but not as consistent as Shepherd. Next up, Etika Scepter. Pretty strong artifact, actually. Being able to reset and turn cycle your skills on mages is pretty good. Obviously, not Ataga Hell's Ancient Book, but certain units can utilize this pretty well. I use it on Carrot, for example. And if you're fighting things like Bellions, Etika Scepter might be actually pretty decent as a substitute for those anti-Bellion units because you can't carry Book. Next up, we have Secret Art Storm Sword. Now, this is usually used on Spirit Eye Selene or Earth Selene, and this artifact is just really good. It's also used on Tempest Surin as well. Good for anti-cleaving. So if your opponent uses a non-attack skill, you get to just pop up with your Storm Sword and cut them in combat readiness. So pretty good with that. That's usually used on a fast Spirit Eye Selene, like a speed build, or it's used on a Tempest Surin that's used to cut those cleave units. And Green Selene, I mean, she just utilizes this pretty well. Get you an attack buff, get you combat readiness, and you'll start your next turn being able to S3 with an attack buff. Next up, we have Holy Sacrifice. Now, Holy Sacrifice, I'm putting this here with a little asterisk next to it. Holy Sacrifice is really only good if you have it max limit broken. So if you're like, oh, I want a Holy Sacrifice, and you want to use your 5-star Selector on it, reconsider, because without a max limit broken Holy Sacrifice, you only have a 75% chance at +15 to revive. I don't think you want that 25% chance to proc in a very high stakes match and your unit doesn't come back, right? Because you're essentially playing the entire match without an artifact and just hoping that you get this to proc. Now, if you have this max limit broken, it is a very strong artifact utilized by a lot of knights in this current meta, LRK, ROL, for example, because when you get trapped by the Leica Straze draft and they Straze you and they S3 and your ROL goes bye-bye, she'll come back with a Holy Sacrifice and it's as if nothing ever happened, right? So it's starting to see a little resurgence in the meta right now. Next up, in the niche options, I'm not going to go as in-depth as the first 3 categories up here, mostly for the sake of time, because I don't want to make this like a hour-long video talking about artifacts. But for the niche ones here, Little Queen's Huge Crown, okay, it's decent. You can use it for things like light expeditions or against barrier units. It's not too bad. Alabastron's pretty good for things like Winter or any thief that you need to debuff with, because it increases your effectiveness and grants you the ability to have some pretty strong debuffs in there. Alensonox's Wrath is good for your warriors that need extra crit chance. Typically only really good for Alencia herself because of the extra follow-up effect on follow-up attacks. But yeah, otherwise it's kind of niche, right? If you have Ed's Artifact, it's kind of similar, and Ed's Artifact is what I use personally on Alencia instead of this. Ancient Dragon's Legacy is pretty niche. You usually use it on something like Fire Lilius. I've also seen people just use it on the Great Mortelix himself. Just keep in mind that the cooldown reduction only happens 1 time, but you can just grant yourself crit damage buff, which is pretty good. The more imprints you have on this, the better, because it increases your odds of getting that crit damage buff. Blackhand the Goddess, even though it just had a recall, it's actually really good for certain units. I know people have built like 300 plus speed Tomokas with Blackhand the Goddess, because you can ignore some crit rate and just slap everything into speed, and Blackhand the Goddess will make up for that. Usually put it on a mage that just needs that 1 turn. So Tomoka just needs that 1 turn to S3 and hit and kill somebody. Blackhand the Goddess is pretty good for something like that. Next up, Bloody Rose, usually only used on Zeo in this current meta. You can actually, I guess you can cheese and try to put Vampiric Touch on other units and just try to heal and lifesteal from it, but with so many cleansers running around, Zeo's the only unit that really utilizes this, and people don't even run it for the effect, they just run it for the flat effectiveness that you gain, because it's an absurd amount of effectiveness, and lets you hit units that have 250, 300 resistance pretty easily. Circus Fantasia for the same reason. See, Lilia sometimes runs this if they want a lot of effectiveness to be able to provoke or push back certain high effect res units. So it's pretty decent for that, but other than that, not really used. Crown of Glory is also pretty good for knights if you don't want to have Aureus on them because they're a little bit more fragile. Maybe the HP pool isn't the highest. It's pretty good against cleave units too because you could take souls away from them. And yeah, you also reduce the amount of AoE damage that you take. Dignus Orb. So this artifact here is kind of falling out of favor. Again, most Tomokas nowadays are running something like Blackhand the Goddess, just to be able to be faster in terms of their speed. But Dignus Orb, it's still used for some mages, I guess. It's just very niche. You get a nice little barrier, you get a lot of protection, but yeah, not really the greatest right now, because it's falling off in favor for other things. A lot of Tomokas are also just holding Book to be able to soul burn other units with. Goblet of Oath. So Peyra uses this quite well. I've seen Penelope's also use this too. It's actually quite clever. But yeah, other than that, nobody else really uses this except for Peyra. And it's only really if you want to turn cycle your Peyra a lot. Most Peyras nowadays are probably running something like RNL, for example, because you gain sort of the same effect. It's a bit more RNG, right? But you gain sort of the same benefits, and RNL is better in the long run. Goblet of Oath has a limit, although that you don't really ever reach the limit of 3 times per match. Idol's Cheer is getting pretty popular right now with Rowana. Rowana with Idol's Cheer into ML Landy, so I personally use this myself. It's also pretty good for Earth Expeditions and things like that to push up your DPS units and get them unstunned from the boss's effects. So pretty decent artifact over here. Indestructible Gators, also used sometimes. ML Kawazu is a very popular unit that's using this right now. because you don't build Kawazu with crit, having the chance to get that extra burn would actually have a ton of damage output increase for the ML Kawazu. So that's why it's over here. Again, pretty niche. I usually mostly use it in Guild Wars, and I don't use it in RTA. Next up, Rise of a Monarch. Again, also pretty niche. Gets you a barrier for... It's kind of like an FCC passive, but in an artifact. So pretty good for a knight if you really don't know what to put on him. You don't really want two knights with Aureus on the same team in most cases. So if you have another knight that you like to draft along with, let's say, an LRK or an Arwell, and you don't want Aureus because you already have Escort, Rise of a Monarch's okay. Sacred Tree Branch. So I put this in here because a couple units can actually utilize it pretty well. DDR and Sharoon, for example. You gain effectiveness, and then you also get to push up combat readiness of the person with the highest attack. So it's pretty good on Sharoon. I actually wish I kind of had this. But yeah, it's kind of overshadowed by a lot of generic healing and support things. You know, Doctor's Bag Celestine, for example, is super, super strong. And if you wanted the effect, Idol's Cheer is also not that bad for gaining that combat readiness. Next up, Samsara Prayer Beads. So I put this in here because if you have a generic warrior, you can utilize this pretty well. The only downside is that it only benefits you if you're a single target DPS and you're getting hit by a single target attack. So it's a bit more niche than something like Merciless Glutton. Merciless Glutton, you get the damage output that you want, but then you also get the CR pushing, right? But Merciless Glutton is normally used for attack scaling units, for like cleave and aggro, and then Samsara Prayer Beads are more for like bruisers, right? But bruisers have so many good options out there, like Golden Rose, for example, that Samsara Prayer Beads kind of falls off a little bit. Scroll of Shadows is Arya's artifact, really good for Arya. Although you can actually kind of get the same effect with Fairy Tale for a Nightmare. Now that is a limited artifact, so do keep that in mind. Scroll of Shadows is really good on Arya in general. Gets you some damage output and gets some debuffs out there. Shamadra's Staff is over here for niche. It is really good on Maid Chloe. Maid Chloe with Shamadra's Staff provides a bunch of resistance for the entire team. And yeah, it's pretty solid in terms of helping your healing output too. I put Spear Purification over here. Some warriors, namely for me, personally, ML Kawazu has Spear Purification on him, so that when an opponent does a non-attack skill, I get to cut up in combat readiness just a little bit. Makes up for usually when C. Lilius is trying to push him back and provoke him. He gets to push up a little bit to mitigate that. Spear of a New Dawn, pretty much only used on Senya. I have seen some people use it on things like Fire Charlotte too, but mostly used on Senya. Really strong. And it's kind of like a, what is that called? Rocket Punch Gauntlet, but it's attack scaling, right? So Senya's attack scaling, and she's the only one that can really utilize it. Spirit's Breath, used for Aeola. Again, really niche, right? Not really used elsewhere. Most people used it on Alots back in the day. You can always just continuously S2 with your Alots if you had this at max limit break. Which actually works out quite well. If you have this max limit broken, you can use it on Alots in something like the Ice Expedition, and you can utilize it pretty well to keep pushing up your DPS unit. Stella Harpa is next. This is usually used on things like Rowana. So when your opponent has a lot of counterattacks or extra attacks and dual attacks and things like that, they'll have multiple chances to hit your Soul Weaver that's holding this. And because it's not a once per turn clause, you can actually just cleanse a bunch of debuffs on your team if you're lucky. So fantastic artifact to have, but again, very niche. Sword of Summer Twilight is a good damage artifact for thieves, but it's mostly for AoE. Most people that use it on something like Vildred, for example, when you're cleaving, because it does penetrate defense, which is not too shabby. Time Matter. Time Matter's, again, units that can utilize this are usually ones with pretty low cooldowns on their skills. Usually things like Vivian, for example. You see it in PvE content like Banshee one-shot teams a lot, but I've also seen units like Tomoka and stuff utilize this too. Next up, Touch of Rekos. Touch of Rekos is a little niche. You have to get hit to heal the whole team, and it's only once per turn. Normally, something like Guardian Ice Crystals is typically better. This does heal everyone on the team for a percentage of their health, which is not bad, but typically you want to be able to control what you're healing. So Rod of Amaryllis, Celestine, Doctor's Bag gives you a bit more control rather than having your opponent rely on your opponent having to hit you, right? And it's specifically the Soul Weaver. So unlike Guardian Ice Crystals, right? Guardian Ice Crystals, anybody can be hit, and then the healing can proc, but this is specifically the Soul Weaver carrying it, so a bit worse. Uberius' Tooth, so kind of like Spear of a New Dawn. It's kind of like Rocket Punch Gauntlet, yet again, but it's for warriors. So usually you see this on something like Hua Young back in the day, but even nowadays you can see it on things like Arunka, which can utilize it pretty well. Unseen Observer is usually used on Flan or other rangers that have a non-attack skill that can be used to open up a match. It gives you 10 free souls, which is not bad. Usually you can use it to soul burn some units afterwards. So you usually use it on Flan, and then Flan will use their non-attack skills, give your team more souls, and you can soul burn for damage, and usually cleave. Violet Talisman, I put it down here in niche. Some units can utilize this, but compared to all the other evasion artifacts, namely like Double-Edged Crescent and Shepherd of the Hollow, it's just not as good because it takes 3 turns to ramp up to full power. Now, if you manage to keep your evasion unit alive for that long, congratulations, you're one very, very lucky player. But yeah, Violet Talisman, it's kind of niche. It's not terrible, but it's also not the best. Moonlight Dreamblade is kind of equivalent to this too. Wings of Light and Shadow. So this recently got buffed. I think it's pretty good for just some DPS knights out there. For example, I put this on my Charles because I don't have enough crit rate on him, but I don't really use Charles anywhere. It's kind of niche. You can use this on things like Ilanov, units that kind of need a turn to set up, usually with an S3. So Charles and Ilanov, right, provides like an attack buff for the team or a crit damage buff for the team. And then on subsequent turns, you'll be dealing extra damage. So pretty good for those types of units. But again, most of those units will also just really love Elber's Ritual Sword, which is in the must-own category. Bastion of Perlucia is a decent artifact. It's not as good because it's pretty much a one-and-done type thing. You do give immunity to the unit on your team with the highest attack and a nice chunky barrier. Most of the time people use this on Eaton, so they build like a 40k like HP Eaton, and he sits there, Bastion of Perlucia, providing a ginormous barrier to your DPS unit, and then you're just kind of alive until DJB comes around and S2s. Spatio-temporal fan is the next one. Typically only Lua uses this. I have seen, I think, Leica use this before as well. But yeah, typically between those two, you get the stealthy unit on your team with the highest attack, which is pretty nice, pretty good for kind of catching opponents off guard. Yeah, pretty decent, but again, really niche. Next up is Snow Crystal. You usually see this on things like Shu. It's a pretty decent artifact, actually, overall. And you can use it on things like Holly Yufine too for some extra combat readiness pushes. And you use it to cut. I have one on Assassin Cartusia as well. Again, if he evades, he gets to push up himself. And then Snow Crystal pushes him up too, because evasion counts as a non-critical hit. So Snow Crystal is pretty good for just giving you that combat readiness to cut your opponent, take the turn, and mess up their momentum. And then last but not least in this category, Sword of Winter Shadow. Now this is at the end as well, kind of like a Holy Sacrifice, little asterisk next to it. You kind of need a maximally broken version of this for you to really benefit from it. So it's over here. It's really, really niche. Some units can utilize it, but it's not the best, right? Ron can use it, for example. And then in the category of Just Don't, I will scroll through so you can see the names. I'm not going to talk about these in depth. Some of them are actually really good in certain scenarios, like Cradle of Life is good for Ancient Inheritance, but you're not going to be wasting your once a year 5-star artifact selector on a on an Ancient Inheritance artifact, are you? So there you go. Those are the Just Don'ts, and that will be it for this video, guys. So if you did not see an artifact on the list, it was probably in the unavailable category. If I misplaced any of them in the unavailable category and they should be available, let me know. But I think I got all of them in there. Let me know what your opinions are on this 5-star selector tier list, and let me know which artifact you're going to be going for in a couple of days. With that being said though, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I really do appreciate it. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe for more Epic 7 content. And until next time, take care.